Good morning, everybody. Thanks for making it out. I'm David Willett. I'm a professor of art history here in the art program at College of DuPage. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th installment of our Visiting Artists series. This is the final event for the fall semester. The next lecture won't be until February 6th. So I'm glad that you guys have all made it, and I'm glad that you're here to share this talk with us. Just to remind you that this series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Art Gallery and the art program at the College of DuPage, and also to take a moment to please silence your cell phones, and if you have to leave during the talk, please use the doors at the back of the auditorium. So after the lecture, we'll have a couple of minutes also for some questions, and also we have a couple of additional announcements for you, so if you don't mind hanging around. And with that said, I'd like to introduce today's guest, who is joining us from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he is, let me get this right, the Goldabelle Macomb Finn Distinguished Professor of Art History, and that is Dr. David Getsy. Dr. Getsy has a PhD from Northwestern University, and his work focuses on three-dimensional art forms, sculpture, performance, and installation, and his work seeks to, in his own words, quote, excavate the competing accounts of personhood that underwrite histories of figuration and abstraction, end quote. Dr. Getsy has published widely on the history of sculpture, performance, identity, and criticism, including his books, Abstract Bodies, 60s Sculpture in the Expanded Field of Gender, 2015, Rodin, Sex in the Making of Modern Sculpture, 2010, and Body Doubles, Sculpture in Britain, 1877 to 1905, from 2004. Today he's here to share with us some of his more recent work, as well as lead a discussion of his article, Acts of Stillness, for those of you that are either in my modern and contemporary art class or have signed up with me. So please join me in welcoming Dr. David Getsy.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you. Can you all hear me all right? Good. And it's great to be here, and thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank David Willett and the College of DuPage for hosting me today. Now, before I jump into the talk, I wanted to kind of preface with a few words about sort of what I do and why I do it. One of the things that I've been shifting into in the last, say, 10 years of my work has been really focusing on the ways in which visual histories of gender and sexuality demand a new kind of attention. And so much of my work has been focused on uncovering transgender, queer, and feminist histories in art and performance, especially in the last 5 decades. And so one of the things that I've tended to do is either look back at received histories for evidence of counter-narratives, for moments of survival, flourishing, and resistance, basically avenues of identification for contemporary viewers. Now, this is especially important when thinking about questions of gender and sexuality, and in particular, transgender subjects, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer subjects, because official histories often contain erasure of those subjects, do not allow them to be recognized in official histories, and have propagated the removal of stories of other people that might make contemporary transgender, queer, gay or lesbian or bisexual subjects feel that they're not quite so alone historically. So one of the things I do is think about the way that art is significant in this. Art is a reflective activity that through which we are able to see each other's pictures and hear each other's stories. And so it's particularly important to try and think about the ways in which this reflection on the world and the history of it has all of these kind of capacities in it to see differently the ways in which contemporary subjects can find history as a source of survival, nourishment, flourishing, and edification. So that said, I wanted to preface that talk about this work. This is I'm talking about in the formal paper, but the work of Stephen Barbel, who I'm going to be talking about, this is the first history that's ever been written of this artist's work. So it's the result of about 5 years of oral history interviews, archival work, and tracking things down. There's very little written. You can find him on Google a little bit, and there's a couple places where you'll see some of the images online, but literally there's been no comprehensive history of his very short career, which lasted only about 7 years in the 1970s. And so this is an example of the kind of work I'm doing to sort of bring back a figure from the past who hadn't had a presence. Now, all historians try to do this, but one of the things that's significant about Barbel's work, and I'm going to try and convince you by showing you the whole thing, everything he's done, is to talk about, in addition to him focusing on gender and sexuality as key components of his practice and its protest against institutions, commercial institutions, he was also so effective in being an outsider, being a disruptor, that he was doubly not included into official histories. So that's a little framework for kind of what we're going to be seeing. But again, I'm excited to share this with you. And so very few people have actually seen the history of Stephen Barbel. And it's also, I hope, fun as well. So in the 1970s in New York, Stephen Barbel was iconic. In elaborate costumes made out of street trash, food waste, and found objects, his gender-confounding pantomime performances erupted in the streets and interrupted art world events. The critic Gregory Batcock said that Barbel was, quote, considered by some the embarrassment of Soho and by others the only real touch of genius south of Houston Street, unquote. Despite his fame, or rather his infamy, Barbel is today largely forgotten. Perhaps because of his antagonism to institutions, galleries, and museums, he never found a place in our historical narratives of the decade, and there's been hardly anything written about his work since his death in 1984. Now, I first saw Barbel's name in the archives of another artist on whom I'm working, Scott Burton. And Burton, in this interview, was asked who the most challenging and provocative gay artist of the 1970s was, and he said Stephen Barbel. Now, I had never heard of Stephen Barbel. I couldn't find much about him, and so that's what kind of set me on this path. And I started to piece together what could be found about him. And what I encountered as I searched was evidence of an artist who is deeply antagonistic and infiltrating of the commercialized art world and its institutions. And as a result of the normal art historical record of objects, reviews, and provenances, he doesn't really exist because of that antagonism, or exist in those histories. So what I'm going to show you is not is still incomplete. I'm still filling in the gaps. And there's performances about which I still don't know a lot. Most things are coming from the occasional newspaper reporting, or if I've been able to track down someone who saw the performances. There's many of the objects are lost. They've been destroyed in fires, or oftentimes just thrown away because, as you see, they're made of trash to begin with. Many of the details of his life can't be triangulated, but nevertheless, I thought, despite all of these gaps in my best guesses, this is, as far as I can tell, the only comprehensive history of his practice. And so my central aim is going to be to give you this overview, but I'm actually going to go fairly quickly rather than dive deeply into individual performances. But we can talk about that if anyone wants to in the closing sections. Now, there's three central phases in Barbel's short career. First, the years of collaboration with the Fluxus artist Jeffrey Hendricks, and second, his guerrilla artistic practice in the mid-1970s that brought him the most amount of his notoriety, and third, the final years of isolation after receding from the art world. I'm going to really focus on the center phase, though, because that's the one where it's the most productive. Well, Barbel's story begins in Owensboro, Kentucky in 1946. He was a choir boy, and he was rumored, perhaps apocryphally, to have been the child protege of Liberace. but I haven't been able to figure out how this Kentucky kid could have managed that. This Southern upbringing instilled in him a deep sense of religiosity, which would in later years become displaced into an almost martyr-like zeal about his practice and its importance. He later remarked, quote, "My parents wanted me to be a missionary, but I became a monster instead," unquote. He received an undergraduate degree from the University of Kentucky, and then he moved to New York City in 1969 to pursue an MFA in film direction at Columbia University, which he received in 1971. Now, from all accounts, Barbel's style and content was heavily influenced by the underground filmmaker Jack Smith, and he met this legendary filmmaker early on in his New York years. Like Smith, who I'm not going to really go into, both Smith and Barbel created lush visual personal mythologies that confounded narrative and propriety. So Smith, famously, his film Flaming Creatures was banned for its engagement with questions of sexuality. Barbel was deeply engaged with Smith's practice, would go to his weekly lectures that Jack Smith was giving, and really considered him the main kind of artistic mentor that he had during these years. But one of the things that's most pivotal in Barbel's life is when he met the artist Jeffrey Hendricks in 1971 at a party at the Gay Activist Alliance in New York. Now, this became a crucial aspect of his life as he shifted from being a film director into a performance artist. And Hendricks and Barbel had a collaborative artistic and romantic relationship that lasted over the next 3 years. And it's in the context of being with Hendricks that Barbel's performance and costume practices really flourished and emerged. And much of what he did in these years was created to contribute to or accompany one of Hendricks's works. Now, just briefly, Hendricks, just after Barbel met Hendricks around the summer of 1971, he witnessed the older artist's major work, Ring Piece, at the 8th Annual Avant-Garde Festival in New York City. And in this piece, Hendricks was sitting atop a mound of dirt, and he remained silent for 12 hours writing in a journal. White mice from the artist Dick Higgins's work, Mice All Over the Place, came to be part of the experience as they started to scurry up the mound and around the floor. The work followed and was in direct relationship to Hendricks' own previous work called The Flux Divorce. He's a Fluxus artist, and so everything has the word flux attached to it. From a few months earlier, in which Hendricks and his wife both decided to get a divorce and ended their marriage because they both wanted to pursue same-sex relationships. The mound of dirt on which Hendricks sat in this piece actually has buried within it objects from the marriage, all of which have been split in two. So their bed, their marriage certificate, and so on. And Hendricks is sitting upon this mound of dirt as both mourning the previous decade of his life, but also thinking about the moment of radical transformation that he was courageous enough to take at this moment. Now, Ring Piece is a major public work of queer art, and it was unprecedented in the early 1970s to be so open about this. And it's both radical and poetic, and I kind of wish I could just talk a little bit more about it. But one of the things that's important about this work is that it begins to travel. And with Barbel, they do a European tour where they reprise the Ring Piece in a set of works called Silent Meditation. And in these later manifestations, Barbel would walk blindly, as in blindfolded, around the mound of dirt, offering a kind of parallel performance. And so the work became, this collaboration was both about their artistic practice, but also it was staging their new partnership together. And this is a central part in all of Hendricks' journals when he's writing about this piece. Now, one costume that Barbel wore in both the London and the German versions of Hendricks' Silent Meditation was the wooden dress that you can see here on the right. And And this is the first major costume work that Barbel created. It was initially made for a collaborative performance of his and Hendrix's done on Long Island titled Equinox, and it was performed in March '72. The day-long performance, as Hendrix recalled, was, quote, "on one level, our marriage ceremony," unquote. In this work, the wooden dress is the counterpart to Hendrix's formal tuxedo. And subsequent performances of Barbel's blind walks in Europe and in the United States use the wooden dress in collaboration with Hendrix's tuxedo to kind of stage this binary gender relationship that is about the taking on this kind of unconventional wedding. In this respect, we have to remember that the wooden dress is a de facto wedding dress for this marriage ritual, and it was used as such in later works. Now, Barbel's costumes began to lead him to perform in unconventional spaces, including outdoors, and he created a series of works in which he was also blindfolded and moving through public spaces in New York City. And by blindfolding himself, he was both vulnerable and bold. The work afforded Barbel the opportunity to be apart from the everyday around him, and he was granted liberties and accommodations that he would not have otherwise have had. And this laid the foundations for his later performance practice, in which, armed in his costumes that became increasingly bolder, he would perform allegories of class, gender, and of fame. He performed the blind walk along Fifth Avenue and into Central Park, and here he's carrying a large board like a martyr walking through the streets. And again, he's accompanied, he's not in the frame of this, but he's accompanied by Hendrix in his tuxedo nearby. And again, I'm going through some of these early costumes, especially fairly quickly. Another costume that made for silent meditation was Barbel's Sky God costume, which was used in his play Silent Prayer that he produced at La Mama Theater in New York in 1973. Now, I can't go into this work in depth, but I just want to point out this is another moment of collaboration, since Hendrix designed the sets for this and also acted as the Sky God in the play itself. During these years, Barbel's costumes, as you can already begin to see, become more and more ambitious and more conceptual. This can best be seen in the slide dress, which is perhaps the most important work of this early phase. And it was made from Hendrix's personal slides of his family and his work. And it was constructed by Barbel without getting permission from Hendrix to take all of these slides. Now you have to remember, before digital imagery, right, the photographs were much more precious because they were singular objects. A color slide isn't a negative in that it's not multiple. It's a unique image, right? You take it directly on the color slide, and so you have the one thing. It's a whole other process to try to turn that into a physical photograph. And so these slides were incredibly important because they were the family vacations for Hendrix's life before he got his divorce, and it had his children in it and all of that. And so Barbel, without permission, created this dress out of them. And in this form, they become useless as memories and archives, and they only become material for the dress. Now, Barbel didn't care about the propriety or value of these unique materials, and he transgressed their intended use and repurposed them for his flamboyant display. Now, this is important because we're going to see that it's indicative of a general strategy of Barbel's in which the sanctity of art's rituals and objects and propriety, all of which are kind of built up here in the form of the slide archive, are completely violated. More importantly, though, this dress kind of appropriates those family memories of Hendrix's earlier decade and signals a kind of aggressive act against that former life and marriage. Now, the two split in September of 1974, and it was at this point that Barbel's practice really takes off. He had an adjunct teaching position at Richmond College, which is now the College of Staten Island, in 1974 and 75, and put on plays with the students there. He also began to become increasingly engaged with his costumes, and he developed a female alter ego named Marie Debris. So trash and debris, it's very funny, actually. It was through Marie Debris that Barbel started developing his signature style and his guerrilla art practice. He abandoned the more unwieldy, over-constructed costumes like Sky God and the slide dress for works that more explicitly conveyed female gender. The dream dress, which you see here installed at his 1976 solo exhibition, incorporated plastic flowers and twigs, with the headdress being made of laminated salt dough cookies and carpet thread. He made this dress for a return home to Kentucky in 1974, but then subsequently used it for a series of performances he did in non-theater spaces, such as the one in the Richmond College cafeteria that you see the little news story about on the right. Now, a photograph of Barbel in this dress attracted the novelist Fernanda Eberstadt, who was then just aged 14. And she's actually one of my most important sources for this project. Now, Fernanda had seen him do an impromptu performance at St. Mark's Church and then kept this clipping, and this is actually a photograph of her clipping in her purse. At the Easter Day parade in March of 1975, she spotted Barbel performing in one of his elaborate dresses amidst the crowds. She recalled, quote, it was getting a little dicey. People were angry. A lot of times with Stephen, guys were very offended and got very aggressive, and it got very physically threatening. The mood was turning, and people were insulting him, unquote. Now, at that point, Eberstadt approached Barbel's then boyfriend, the composer Robert Savage, and showed them this clipping that she kept in her purse. At that point, Barbel shifted his attention to her and started performing directly for her, and her presence helped divert the crowd's anger just enough until the three were able to escape down the subway. Now, they became friends after that, and Eberstadt's diaries from these years offer an intimate portrait of Barbel's personality and emotions as he struggled to articulate a personal and an artistic identity. And I should just point out, so Eberstadt was incredibly precocious as a young teenage girl, and her parents were actually patrons of Jack Smith, the filmmaker I talked about before. So Jack Smith's Normal Love was, the film Normal Love was filmed at the Eberstadt's country house. And so she had been wrapped up in the underground art scene already. So this is why she was so attuned at the age of just 14 to this. But so her teenage diaries are actually one of my great sources for the work, because she describes all of the parties they're going to and the events and things like that. One of the entries, for instance, she wrote in 1975 said, quote, last night Stephen came over. He was terribly depressed. He was going to come in drag, but Dad protested, so that I called him again and asked to appear as Stephen. He was distraught. He feels very dubiously about his own self outside of Marie Debris and said it was a vile drag, no double entendre here, and like asking a peacock to appear in a raincoat, unquote. Now, Eberstadt's account is important for how we're thinking about the ways in which the received history of Barbel, as it is, may be inadequate. Because this little anecdote captures the pivotal period just before Barbel would gain notoriety, and also indicates his own struggle with his sense of self in these years. Others that I've talked to as well remembered that Barbel would show up at private dinners in self-made dresses. He would transform street trash into fashion, much like he sought to transform himself through this process. Now, his own relationship to gender would shift repeatedly in the following years, and many of his friends would remark that he could be seen one day in an outrageous costume and another in the uniform of a gay 1970s Leatherman. Eberstadt, in an interview with me recently, recalled, quote, he liked to go back and forth between playing it more butch, his construction worker gear, and just being Marie Debris, unquote. Now, accounts from friends such as Eberstadt and another source of mine, the photographer Greg Day, whose photographs you'll see throughout, established that Barbel was an engaged participant in the leather and cruising scenes of the mid-1970s. And there's much evidence for Barbel adopting various exaggerated signs of gender as a means of combining them and finding a kind of third way between them. He sometimes, for instance, as you'll notice in some of the slides, retains a beard when performing in largely female signifying costumes. And already in 1972, he had stated, quote, "All great stars must be androgynous, like Mick Jagger. His vacillations between male and female are captivating," unquote. Now, the swings in Barbel's own personal presentation of gender favored extremes, and his work would play out complicated signifiers of female gender in an exaggerated manner as support for his coquettish pantomime performance practice. He became increasingly bold in his performances and in his innovative costumes, with gender confusion becoming a central tactic for his attention-grabbing performances as Marie de Brie in public spaces. And soon thereafter, he developed the work that would secure his notoriety, the costume tour of New York in 1975. Like the earlier blind walk performances that I went through just briefly, Barbel's work relied on the unauthorized use of the common space of the urban street. His target for these, however, was not a generic Manhattan street, but the increasingly gentrified zone of cultural entertainment and commerce that was the Soho neighborhood in New York. Throughout the 1970s, Soho, which stands for south of Houston Street, had become a tourist zone on weekends, with its clusters of galleries essentially becoming a free museum of contemporary art. Now, much has been written about the ways in which the art world was the wedge that sort of began the gentrification of this neighborhood. And by the 1970s, Soho, which was once a kind of industrial neighborhood in Manhattan, suddenly became this place where people were coming in from the suburbs and going to, and it became a site where both art and commerce were right on top of each other. Now, Barbel took advantage of this collision of art and Saturday tourism, and his costume tours exaggerated this phenomenon by casting himself in the role of the tour guide. Now, the costume tour involved rogue visits to galleries with onlookers in tow, buttressing his incursions into these commercial spaces. He led a crowd that grew weekly, and he would do these every week for a period of months. As the critic David Borden remembered, quote, "He frequently alarmed straight-laced dealers who feared he would frighten away potential clients," unquote. And Barbel's silence, or rather the occasional clicking and cooing of his pantomime performances, exaggerated the strangeness of his interventions, and his nonverbal sounds helped establish a further distance between his characters and the everyday. Let's also remember that he constructed his costumes out of rubbish and repurposed items, and his aim was not merely to be a spectacle, but to arrest the comfortable elision between the space of art and the space of commerce that the Soho galleries cultivated. Now, we have an account of one of these costume tour stops from the artist I mentioned earlier, Scott Burton, who recalled, quote, "Barbel would go around the galleries on Saturday when they were the most crowded in these various states of being. He would be in a kind of dress made of pipe cleaners and chicken bones, and then go into Castelli Gallery, said to be the most important gallery in the country, and pantomime fainting and swooning at being so moved by the wonderful art on the walls," unquote. Jeffrey Hendricks also provided a further anecdote, remembering that, quote, "Stephen went into a gallery wearing a costume that had 2 milk cartons as breasts, and on bowing, the milk poured forth, much to the dismay of the gallery owner," unquote. So Burton and Hendricks describe one of Barbel's most famous and frequent costumes, the milk dress. It was the first costume to be made primarily out of street trash and food waste, and you can see on the top, you can see chicken bones in the headdress. And it was originally created so that Barbel could crash the gala premiere for the film adaptation of the musical Tommy by the Who in March of 1975. Now, this was a big event. They had a party in a subway station in New York for the opening of this film, and it was a major production. And knowing that this would be a really high-profile event that was also about costume. If you've never seen Tommy, it's full of elaborate costumes on its own. Barbel showed up to the opening uninvited, but he did so like he belonged there. As the writer Glenn O'Brien reported, quote, his limousine lined up with Anne Margaret's, and as the cameras rolled, he dipped out of the car like Jane Mansfield, sloshing milk onto the pavement. Suddenly he was all over the 11 o'clock news, unquote. Now, Barbel described his guerrilla street performances as, quote, freeing artists from the slavery of the galleries. I found my own audience and my own patrons there, unquote. He understood his work as trumping the idea of galleries as the places of buying and selling goods, prioritizing instead performance and event. He told David Burton, the critic, quote, it's literally impossible to become known in the art world through showing your slides around. So I thought, well, I will simply make myself more interesting than any of that art that could possibly be on the walls of the galleries. Since art doesn't have to be permanent anymore, why not make oneself as interesting as possible? Needless to say, this leads to self-perfection, unquote. Such exaggerated quotes from Barbel proliferated, and he assumed a persona that was both messianic and authoritative. At one point, he told Penthouse magazine, which did a lot of interesting arts reporting in the 70s, interesting enough. Barbel told Penthouse magazine, quote, you see, I'm Cher's only real rival. She doesn't do anything but stand there in those costumes, but I go further. By making my gowns from things I find in the street, I show that you can look divine with nothing if you use your imagination. It's a life acted out frame by frame, not in celluloid, but in rubbish and dreams, unquote. Now, in addition to the foundational influence of Jack Smith, Barbel also understood his work as directly related to that of Andy Warhol, whom he had known since the early 1970s, when Barbel worked very briefly at Interview magazine. Warhol once remarked, quote, Barbel is doing the most creative new form of art. He's taken fashion out of the gutter. He was a playwright and interviewer, normal, when one day he arrived at the office in a dress, unquote. Now, important among Barbel's precedents were performers like Jackie Curtis, Mario Montez, and other members of Warhol's factory circle. Barbel's practice differed from such factory personalities and from other early 1970s comparisons, such as San Francisco's Coquettes, in that Barbel adopted the mode of street works for his silent yet extravagant costume performances that would burst into the art and commercial spaces and disrupt art events with his trash charades of the wealthy and the aristocratic. We could, however, compare Barbel's practice to other interventionist street artists in the 1970s, and so just to list a few, Adrian Piper, Tosun Bayrak, Betsy Damon, Andre Cadre, Christopher D'Arcangelo, or William Popel, who's now who now lives and works in Chicago. Now, in addition, Barbel was part of a movement of costume-based performance practices, and there's other costume artists at the same time, such as Eric Brodus, Padalesco, Colette, and Robert Kushner. So these are the larger frameworks that we could think about Barbel as being placed in. But whether it be chicken bones, egg crates, tea bags, six-pack holders, or a cheese grater, Barbel took this all to new levels when he adopted elements of rubbish that never fully masqueraded as high fashion. They were still clearly trash, and he celebrated it. As he said, quote, I'm going to bring trash into the museums. After all, isn't America's garbage the most valuable in the world, unquote. Now, whether there was an art celebrity event, whenever there was an art celebrity event, he attempted to co-opt it and upstage it. For instance, the first costume tour took Barbel to Ronald Feldman Gallery in New York, which was having a major exhibition of the German performance artist Joseph Beuys. Barbel made an appearance as Marie Debris in a performance he later called Love Scene with Joseph Beuys, and the German artist had made a highly publicized visit to New York for concurrent exhibitions in April 1975. Varble, learning of this, made the Elizabethan farthingale dress out of egg crates for this triumphant arrival. His appearance was at the gallery was an attempt to appropriate Boyce's own performance persona and its shamanic reputation. Eric Brodus, who is the performance artist who accompanied Varble on this for this work, recalled, quote, "Boyce was happy to see us," unquote. I don't know if that's true or not. I doubt he was. Other appearances in these same months, and similarly like him, just sort of crashing these events, appear at such unlikely places as the opening of an Anthony Caro exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, the Carnegie Hall Cinema, or the Gotham Bookmark. The final Saturday of the first costume tour, however, saw the unveiling of the performance Fountain of Safety, which featured one of Varble's most iconic costumes, and you've already seen it throughout the slides. This is the pearl dress, also known as the swimsuit. In a skimpy outfit made of rope, a cheese grater, and a life vest that he stole from the Staten Island Ferry when he was adjuncting, Varble's performances involved a hose that he sprayed around the street and at its onlookers. Wearing his own flotation device, Varble was both the cause of the deluge and the rescuer. It was likely this dress, and you can barely see it, with its crocheted genitals hardly covering any of Varble's naked body, that caused one of his many, many run-ins with the police, who objected to his public nudity. So they couldn't be mad because he's, or they couldn't really arrest him for the costume except for the nudity, and he was really pushing it in that regard. One of Varble's most ardent fans was the artist Ray Johnson, who was one of the crowd on a few of the costume tour dates, and Johnson recalled, quote, "One time the police tried to stop him, but I impressed upon them that Steve was a serious artist," unquote. Now, during this time, Varble met an important patron, Morihiro Miyazaki, who was a wealthy Japanese landlord and restaurateur. Now, Miyazaki provided the limousines for Varble's entrances at red carpet events and performances, and one of Varble's friends, the artist Jim McWilliams, recalled that, quote, "Stephen had the idea that he provided private theater for Miyazaki and that it had to be paid for," unquote. Miyazaki's patronage made all the difference, and it provided the opportunity for Varble to parody wealth and celebrity. It also afforded an opportunity to be more ambitious with his costumes. Miyazaki brought from Japan his friend Shibata Atsuko, a seamstress who aspired to be part of the New York art and fashion world, to be Varble's assistant. It was Shibata who was responsible for the more elaborately sewn garments, like the piggyback dress, that I'll show in a second, as well as the silk mannequin sculptures that you'll also see throughout the slides. Now, the piggyback dress was made for a major event, the opening of the exhibition Fashion is Fantasy at the Rizzoli bookstore in New York. The collision of art and fashion was a perfect target for Varble's actions, and he arrived at the opening wearing this pink and blue quilted garment that included breasts filled with pennies that, when released, would spill out over the floor. So he wasn't invited to the opening, but as soon as he showed up, they realized they had to let him in. And he successfully infiltrated the event and became even more notorious. And he soon found himself attending major fashion events and offending people left and right, such as the Metropolitan Museum's famous costume ball, and so on. He was also invited back to Leo Castelli Gallery, where he had showed up with some milk, but this time as Andy Warhol's guest, to be part of the party that launched Warhol's book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol. In typical Varble fashion, Varble cut the book up and made it into a headdress. So just as he had with Hendrix's slides, Varble digested the archive of another artist mentor as raw material for his costume allegories. Characteristically, Warhol loved such puckish antics, saying that Varble was, quote, "the major divinity of his generation," unquote. Concurrent with these invitations to high fashion and art parties, Varble continued his unauthorized interruption of art world events. For instance, Babcock reported that in September 1975, quote, Barbel almost ruined Holly Solomon's opening when he appeared in his styrofoam and lace baby costume, accompanied by a trombonist who kept tooting so you couldn't hear the real music, unquote. He also did a performance in the World Trade Center at 5 p.m. on a weekday, and this is actually an image of the dress I'm talking about, but it's being worn by another artist, Paul Ambrose. But in the typewriter dress, Barbel went to the World Trade Center at 5 p.m. on a weekday. As masses of office workers left for the day on the down escalator, Barbel appeared on the upward-bound escalator wearing the typewriter ribbon dress and a mortarboard hat with an inkwell and plume in it. As he hair-flipped his typewriter ribbon wig, the descending workers saw ink splashing from side to side all over the escalators as he struck poses and escalated to the sky. Now, Barbel's major work in the fall of 1975, however, was his follow-up to the costume tour of New York, the work called Gutter Art. It echoed the same form, a series of regular visits on Saturdays, but this time he started targeting a wider range of locations, including Soho, different Midtown galleries, and the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. At each of these locations, he staged his collision of high and low. So Miyazaki's limousine was a key component, and it set the stage for his transgression of wealth and celebrity. He wore an elaborate costume made from an air conditioner belt, a display board of costume jewelry, and a wig that hovered over his now shaven head. And he exited the limousine and then opened the trunk. He spread a sheet and pillows carefully in the gutter, and he pulled pots, pans, and dishes out, and then spilled ink over everything. He then knelt down and started washing the dishes, some say with champagne. Now, this was all done in the mostly silent pantomime that he made his trademark, and that's one thing we always have to remember is that that silence kind of keeps him somewhat distant. And as with all of his performances, the gutter art actions were meant to disrupt, and consequently they incited aggression and confusion among the audience, requiring Barbel to maintain character. As Augusto Machado, the actor and director, recalled on seeing one of these events, quote, Barbel was strong and emotionally able. There were all these groups of people, and they would talk at him like he wasn't there. He was strong enough in his beliefs to continue, even when they would throw sandwich wrappers or cigarette butts at him, unquote. Now, Barbel commented on this performance, saying, quote, I thought it would be a peculiar juxtaposition to appear in the gutter, especially with attendants and pillows, and done with a proper amount of luxury. In America, when talent and genius become an obsession, it often leads people to the gutter, and it's sad. But when I was there beautifully. I was always out of the gutter and in it. I used the gutter as a metaphor, as an allegorical state, as a path in which to go, unquote. Well, just briefly, gutter art contained all of the key ingredients of Barbel's recipe. He's mocking wealth and sophistication. He's transgressing that power based on gender terms. And he's wearing this elaborate, outrageous outfit with multicolored eyebrows, a fully rouged head, hovering wig, double platform shoes, and the house coat made from, among other things, the air conditioner insulator belt. All of this staging questions of domestic labor while cleaning the dishes. Now, the other main institutional ceremony, as he began to call them, became his most notorious, and this was his unauthorized performance at Chemical Bank in Sheridan Square. Now, ostensibly, this was a protest against the bank, because the bank had allowed a forged check to be cashed against Barbel's account, and he was obviously mad at this, and he demanded the full reinstatement of his funds immediately, but he did so in person. Arriving at high noon in his signature limousine, Barbel entered the bank half naked in a costume made of plastic netting, Monopoly money, gold leaf wrappers, a toy jet fighter as a loincloth, and 2 condoms filled with cow's blood, which served as breasts. He was barefoot, it was reported, quote, to symbolize his economic loss, unquote. Above his head, a cardboard speech bubble read, "Even though you may be forged, chemical still banks best." The performance hinged on issues of authenticity, with Barbel arriving as one of his allegorical characters in order to reject a third party's supposed imitation of him, the forger. So this circular play with authenticity was echoed in that cartoon bubble, which, again, in Barbel fashion, mockingly voiced a cheerful message of endorsement despite the antagonism of his protest and the tactical disruption of the bank's operations. So much like the hyperbolic inhabitation of the trappings of aristocratic elitism, the limo, the entourage, the aspirations to fame, this endorsement of Chemical Bank could not itself be taken as authentic because it was supported by a foundation of rubbish and genderqueer performance. Barbel boldly walked into the bank and up to one of the bank managers at the rear of the bank to make his demands. All of the employees struggled to ignore this flamboyant entrance, while the lines of people at the teller window gawked. The nonplussed bank manager hoped Barbel would go away, but instead he sat himself down on a nearby bench. And then punctured the condoms that were filled with blood, which then spilled over his legs and onto a sheet that he had thrown at his feet. He then dipped a fountain pen into the blood and started writing checks using his silent mime-like movements. Covered in blood and without the legal recognition by the bank, he promptly left to the sound of applause from the customers and sped away in his Rolls Royce. Now, in 1977, Barbel would declare, quote, "This is the age of pornography and contempt. The dollar is God," unquote. But he would also defiantly prophesize the end of capitalism in these same statements. And so it's important to think like, these are somewhat confusing, disruptive performances, and they seem to be kind of frivolous in some ways, but he's always couching these things in a critique of the role of capitalism and commercialism, and an obsession with wealth and fame. Now, increasingly, he began to share with his friends his belief that his work was mystical and religious in its underpinnings. More and more, he challenged the art institutions to treat him as more than mere entertainment by introducing such messianic and critical and political messages. For instance, he wrote to the art historian Robert Rosenblum in 1977, saying, quote, of course I should say right now that my real mission is quite religious. I believe that I am called of God. I am really simply disguised as an artist. That's why costume is so important to me. I trust you appreciate such conceits. Mine, at least, is completely heartfelt. I am not afraid or wish it otherwise," unquote. And again, there's one of the things that's evident throughout Barbel's career is that he is actually deeply religious despite all this, and is struggling to find ways to manifest that, whether that's in the martyr-like form of the blind walks, or in this idea of himself as this kind of this messianic figure. And he called his costumes magic dresses increasingly. Let's see. On a press release, for instance, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, he quotes the famous ethnologist Hubert Fichte, who reportedly said, quote, "Barbel was the world's most powerful witch doctor without knowing it." And other people started to take up this idea of the witch doctor for his work. Now, this endorsement in this press release came as part of an announcement for Barbel's first exhibition, which he organized for himself at his loft at Franklin Street. Adopting a megalomaniac tone and promising a total installation spectacle, he cited major queer cultural figures and got people to attend the exhibition, which was funded by Miyazaki. And it gave a retrospective of his costumes, which he'd only been doing for a few years. Now, the exhibition grew out of his desire to create a total work of art. And it had works that were made from his performance ephemera, his costumes, and so on. He would do performances with these mannequins in the studio as well, and give performative lectures about the works. Now, he was about to be evicted from this loft at the end of April 1976, so he decided to have not just the exhibition, but a major event in which to kind of close it off. And so I'm going to move to that. And for this closing event, he got together an impressive roster of major performance artists, so including a number of the Warhol stars. So Mario Montez, Taylor Mead, Jackie Curtis all performed in tandem with Barbel at the event. Augusto Machado, Ruth Truth, Eric Brodas, and others were there. And the idea was the party was also an overall performance that culminated this. And so it became a big art world event. You had various other costumes being used. This is Eric Brodas, Barbel's sometimes collaborator. Augusto Machado did a separate performance in the refrigerator of Barbel's apartment, enacting a scene of claustrophobia while wearing the Seagram's dress. And so it was not like sort of a planned performance. It was more a kind of drunken party with all of these artists wearing Barbel's costumes and then performing. But there was one kind of key element, which is when all of the performance artists collected themselves into a gigantic pink skirt and performed this parade out of it as it was cut open. And so it became this way of playing out their arrival at the party. And here's just a couple of their party shots since I have them. Now, both the Franklin Street exhibition that I just briefly mentioned and the closing party were parts of Barbel's myth-making. His pronouncements about capitalism and commerce at this time became more frequent and frenetic, and he was really trying to position himself at the center of these various trajectories, all of these 60s trans and genderqueer performance artists who performed with him, but also doing this exhibition that wasn't intending to sell anything as this kind of counterpart to everything else. So it was a kind of self-created exhibition and moment. And he accompanied this by a press junket in which he increasingly began talking to reporters with his pronouncements. And he was quoted, for instance, as saying, quote, "The end of capitalism is coming. TV is the Gothic cathedral of commerce. Capitalism will self-destruct. There will be a new renaissance, a golden age. I am to be a ruler. I'm here to deliver a message," unquote. And such comments were part of his parody of the rich and powerful, through which he undermined them. And his exhibition served this agenda, securing him a key place in these larger histories. His performances began to be more and more outside of the art world. So in addition to Chemical Bank, he did a work at Halston, the fashion designer Halston's boutique, and so on. And he started creating an autobiography that he called My Press Release Life, which was issued through mimeographed press releases that he would distribute. And so in all of these, and I'm not going to go through all of them, you can see that his targets are started at the art world and are then fanning out into other sites of high luxury goods. So Halston Fashion Boutique, and so on. And this culminates in the third costume tour, which included a performance outside of Tiffany's, now the jewelry store. Now, where many of the museums had learned to kind of accept that Barbel was going to bring audience members to the museum and they could endure it, Tiffany's decided it was a no-go, and they hired extra security to keep Barbel out. And this was ultimately this. Happened through a confrontation in which Barbel, in this elaborate costume, performs outside of Tiffany's and trying to kind of get into the store to do it. And Tiffany's no doubt understood the underlying antagonism. And for this event, Barbel said, quote, "Tiffany's kept me in the revolving door, and I just kept revolving. The elephant hoof made a noise like a sledgehammer. You can't really see it in this photograph, but he's wearing a giant taxidermied elephant hoof, the kind of which they used to problematically make into umbrella stands. But he's wearing this, so it's slapping against the revolving door, and they're not letting him out. So this became a kind of moment of high confrontation. Such confrontations continue, and I'm just going to briefly mention final thing. He does have a commercial art show in 1977, but he completely undermines it. He calls it the awful art show. And he's showing drawings and costumes. He priced the work at such a high level that no one would ever buy it. And he said that, of all his drawings, he couldn't actually sell the drawings, but he would sell a photograph of the drawing for an exorbitant amount. He showed up at the opening for it dressed in a costume made out of lettuce leaves. So again, even though he's in the commercial art world, he's infiltrating. After these years, after that experience, he really starts to pull away from the art world, and he does a few more costumes. This is his Christmas tree outfit, and a jacket made out of dog biscuits. But one of the things that happens is that at this moment when Barbel would seem to have achieved the career that most artists wants, getting the commercial gallery show, is exactly when he decides to destroy it all from the inside. So the costume tours and the confrontation that happens at Tiffany's are really significant in this, because he realizes that there's always going to be these moments of antagonism, and that institutions are increasingly trying to absorb him, and the museums kind of liked having him there, but Tiffany's reminded him that he needed to be more antagonistic, and so ultimately he starts pulling away entirely. I'm not going to go into the final phase of his career, in which is basically just him in his apartment doing drawings and making the occasional video, because he pretty much recedes at that moment, and we only have these drawings because they're in a private collection. They weren't shown anywhere. And so for me, one of the things that's most important is thinking about his anti-institutional practice and his critique of the commerce of art as being one of the reasons why there has been no history of him. There's no objects. Luckily, we have photographs, many of which are in private collections, but he so effectively attacked the institutions of art and the kind of value system that turned artists into commodities, right? Turned them into household names and the purveyors of luxury commodities to be bought and sold. That was always his target throughout, and as he became more and more messianic about the problems of capitalism, not just in the art world, but more broadly, his final answer was to exit out from it entirely. And after that commercial show, which was supposed to be the culmination, he more or less recedes, and then tragically dies just a few years later. So it's important for us to think about this not just as a forgotten artist who took gender and sexuality to the streets, but also to think about the kind of double erasure that's been happening, because this work, it plays with questions of kitsch, trash, rubbish, and camp, questions of non-conforming genders, but also a real attack on the very question of value itself. And so in this sense, it's an important to kind of think about this as a different way of acknowledging all the histories that, for similar reasons, we don't have today. All right, thank you very much. I know I gave you a lot, but I really wanted to kind of show you as much because it's so great. So, but yes, right here.
He seemed very young. What was the cause of his death?
He died. The last years of his life are really murky. So, but he most likely died of AIDS-related complications. But he actually had a long-running series of health problems. So the letters that I have from the early 70s, he's already got some issues going on that he's seeing doctors for regularly. Something I didn't go into is he actually ends up participating in this mystical practice that's that's imported into the United States in the 1960s called Subud, that actually contribute, you know, some of his interpretations of how he's supposed to be eating and how he's supposed to be taking care of himself contribute to his decline. So even though the assumption is that it's AIDS-related complications, I have to say it's actually a little murky exactly why, because there's so many health issues happening. Yeah, right.
It seems to me he's also questioning what is art, what do we call art. So where would you place him in sort of the continuum of art history and his impact? I know you've talked about him not having much impact because of the loss and non-coverage of him as an artist. But where would you place him now in the history of art and the question of what is art?
It's a great question. I mean, the 1970s are the moment when performance art really emerges. And you know, it's quite interesting to think about the parallels between the 1970s and the last decade. There's a period of deep economic unrest, economic depression, and many of the normal avenues of patronage and buying and selling just weren't available. And so it's in the 70s that all of these non-commercial practices really begin to flourish. Conceptual art takes on a new form, but performance art becomes in many ways the dominant, or I would say the dominant medium of the 1970s. And so he's very much part of that. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that he has this kind of antagonism to even those institutions that would allow a performance artist to become recognized. That said, that's the kind of performance art angle. The other question around how it relates to the what is art question is that you can see him in a long line of artists, perhaps starting with people like Marcel Duchamp, or even earlier Oscar Wilde, who positioned the persona of the artist as an artwork itself, as thinking about how art operates outside of objects that are the result of high degrees of skill, but rather in these event-based questions that cause us to ask the question, what is art? And one of the trajectories throughout the 20th century is to say that asking that question, what is art, at different historical junctures is incredibly fruitful, because that's when we realize what our values are, what our assumptions are about what art should be. Should it be universal? Should it be personal? Should it be expensive? Should it be affordable? So I would put him as one of those who's really challenging that. And you know, I mean, it's rough to make a dress out of chicken bones and go to a disco, right? Like, that's a challenging act on multiple levels about propriety and what we're supposed to be doing. And so he's really pushing that in a lot of ways.
Maybe one more. I'm curious. There's a real recent trend in commercial spaces, galleries, kind of mining art history to find characters or artists similar to Barbel that they can then kind of rewrite their history and present them and present the artifacts of the practice for their own commercial profit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if attempts of that have happened with his work, and how you simultaneously bring awareness to an artist like this and the issues surrounding their practice, while preventing them from being used to further assist them. They spent their entire career criticizing and trying to undermine.
That's the big ethical challenge for me in doing this material. I mean, he wanted to disappear in some ways, and did work that refused the commercial level. And in many ways, I would compare him to Jack Smith, who I mentioned earlier. Jack Smith never finished a film after he was so disgusted at how his own film, Flaming Creatures, other people had used it for their own fame and their own profit. And so he was, editing things in the screening room while the projection was going on. No film was ever done. This is Jack Smith. And ultimately, Jack Smith denied this question of the archive. Barbel takes that up and is doing the same thing. As a historian, I'm caught between honoring that desire to work against the mechanisms that seek to commodify and seek to sort of normalize the practice. But at the same time, understanding that there are many artists today that I know that as soon as they find out about a practice like Barbel's, they really see a whole different set of resources. And so ultimately, I choose today rather than Barbel's intention. At the same time, though, he was super effective in that there's nothing left. Like there's no objects left to be bought or sold, like no commercial gallery show can happen. Because there's I think I've tracked down 3 extant costume fragments that haven't been destroyed or lost. And I'm trying to put together an exhibition of the photographs, and it's proving difficult because all we have is the photographs, and even the ones that I'm showing you here were not created as art photographs. They're often news photographs or documentation. So there is a question of how those things may be sort of monetized and commodified. But Barbel himself is the sort of, is the empty center of that, because he didn't leave anything, or there's nothing left for us to actually, like no gallery would be interested, other than to, like maybe if they got a photo archive to try and do that, but which still may happen, like one of the photographers that may happen, but he was pretty effective in being difficult. And I think that's, so that's one of the things that is the challenge, and maybe why this may never be an exhibition, or may never be in a show, it may only be in the form of the lecture, or the article, or the book. Thank you all.
So for those of you in